righty, moving right along. We're going to segue to our featured speaker. And with the introductions, here is our club secretary, Ron Felton. Ron?
All right, thank you, Skip. Real quickly, back in 2010, a year after moving to Mexico, I was introduced to an album that had just been released by, some of you might know, the guitarist and record producer Ry Cooder, who did the famous Buena Vista Social Club album from Cuba. Came out with an album with the chieftains, the Irish chieftains, called San Patricio. And I listened to the album, and that was the first time I had learned about the Irish Brigade, as this album was dedicated to them. And the songs are a combination of Irish and Mexican music. So I became intrigued by that and read a little bit about them. And that had been the first time I had heard about them. So when Skip and I were looking for an appropriate speaker for this week, I suggested maybe we could find someone who could talk about the Irish Brigade. And I came across the name of Dr. Michael Hogan, and I reached out to him, and he was gracious enough to accept the invitation to join us here today. Michael is a historian, a teacher, and a workshop presenter. He's author of 22 books that you can see on Amazon, and including among those books is a best-selling history of the Irish Battalion in Mexico, which formed the basis for an MGM movie and 2 award-winning documentaries. Another book that I'm going to get into next is the Abraham Lincoln and Mexico book that's now in over 800 schools and colleges in the US and abroad. He's a former professor of international relations at the Autonomous University of Guadalajara and emeritus humanities chair of the American School Foundation of Guadalajara. He lives with the artist Lucinda Mayo and their Dutch shepherd Lola. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael and take it away.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you all for coming together this morning. Tomorrow is St. Patrick's Day, so I think it's appropriate that here in Mexico, we talk about the St. Patrick Battalion, which fought in the US-Mexican War of 1846 to 48. The 1840s is not so distant that we can't identify. It was a time of a surge in reading in the US. Edgar Allan Poe was the Stephen King of the day. He was writing horror stories and detective stories and a few memorable poems like The Raven. Henry David Thoreau was hanging out at Walden Pond, and he would not only protest against the war, but would write Civil Disobedience, a work which later influenced generations, including Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And it continues to be read widely today. In new technologies, the Royal typewriter was introduced. Excuse me. The singer-sewing machine and the telegraph, which would carry the latest news of the war to newspapers throughout the world. Excuse me, I have a little frog in my throat this morning. I don't know why. Reminded me of the story of the 2 Irishmen, one in County Kerry and one in County Cork, and they had a small bridge between the 2 counties, the 2 towns, and each year they would meet to repair the bridge, and each side would fix their side of the bridge, but they leave about 10 meters in the middle. And they'd argue about whose responsibility it was to clean up the middle of the bridge and repair it. And one day an Irishman, in the middle of this discussion, an Irishman from Kerry stood up and he says, I'm sick and tired of all this bickering about whose responsibility it is to clean up the middle of the bridge. He says, it's no big deal. We're only talking about 10 meters here. For Christ's sakes, I could piss halfway across it. And the chairman said, excuse me, sir, you're out of order. He said, well, of course I'm out of order. If I was in order, I could piss the whole way across it. So that's me this morning with my voice. So please excuse me. I'm a little bit out of order. So, you know, the latest news of the world would be carried through the telegraph. And for the first time, a war would actually be covered in the newspapers throughout the world almost simultaneously. Within the next day, you'd have the news of what was going on in Mexico through the telegraph. Also, trains and steamships would carry people and freight to distant cities. But as you all know, there was a dark side as well. There was a great famine in Ireland, and over 1 million Irish landed on the shores of North America. The feeling in the United States was feeling crowded. Many people felt we should expand westward, even though much of that land belonged to Native Americans, and large swaths of it was Mexican territory. One newspaper man said, it was the manifest destiny of the US to conquer the whole continent and push the Indians out of the way. And many Americans agreed. And as for the Mexicans who might be in the way, well, the poet Walt Whitman, writing for a New York newspaper, said, what does miserable, inefficient Mexico have to do with those whose destiny is the New World? It is the obligation of our more noble race to overcome her. Now, there's a plaque in San Angel, a suburb of Mexico City, that has the names of over 70 Irishmen. And the inscription reads, dedicated to the memories of the St. Patrick's Battalion, who gave their lives for Mexico in the unjust US invasion of 1846 to 48. Among the names are Sullivan, O'Reilly, Kelly, Hogan, Cassidy, Murphy, McClellan, among others. How they came to be in Mexico, how they were tortured and hanged, and why it has taken so long for this history to be fully written is the subject of my discussion today with you all. It kind of begins on the other side with the famine of the 1840s. Over 1 million Irishmen arrived in the US. They faced discrimination, poverty, overcrowding, and unemployment. The death rate of Irish children in Boston, for example, was 10 times that of Anglo-Saxon children. Prejudice in the United States was not only based on religion, but it was also based on, not only based on race rather, but it was also based on religion. America was an Anglo-Protestant country. It was a country which defined itself not by what it was. Most people didn't really talk about themselves as Americans. They talked about themselves as Northeasterners or Downeasterners if they were from Maine, or Bostonians or Virginians. It defined itself by what it was not. And it considered Indians, Negroes, Celtic people, Asians, Catholics, Jews as inferior and unevolved. In addition, the pseudoscience of phrenology, which measured skulls, clearly showed that the Irish, Negroes, and Indians were inferior. They were less involved. And this was in the high school science text in Boston in 1845. How did this concept of manifest destiny come about? Well, from the time of the arrival of the Puritans in Salem in the early 1600s, now it was called Salem as a short way of saying New Jerusalem. This was the city on the hill that these Anglo-Protestants considered. It was anti-monarchist, anti-hierarchical, so certainly not Catholic, no popes, no bishops, no priests, and completely different from Europe. Also completely different from the Church of England, which they rebelled against. And their belief was that God intended this new country to expand from sea to shining sea and encompass the entire continent. And it's called manifest destiny. Manifest means obvious. There's no need to prove it. And destiny means it was willed by a higher power, so no way to stop it. And it was a self-serving and a self-fulfilling proposition, actually, because when Napoleon got in trouble, he ended up selling, what became the Louisiana Purchase and adding almost twice as much land as we originally had to the United States. So by 1830, a group of American immigrants from the United States began settling in the Mexican state of Coahuila and Tejas. Part of the agreement was that they brought no slaves with them and that they were members of the Catholic faith and that they brought no guns except for personal protection. Well, they violated all of these terms, obviously. They were the first illegal immigrants in the Americas, and they eventually rose up against the Mexican government and declared independence. They wanted their own state, and they wanted it to be a slave state. And in 1836, they established the Lone Star Republic. In 1845, Texas became a state. And James K. Polk, who was elected president at the time, on a platform of expansion, tried to buy California and New Mexico from the government of Mexico, the dream of sea to shining sea again. And he offered the Mexicans $25 million for California and $5 million for Santa Fe and the route to New Mexico. Well, Mexico refused to consider it. Meanwhile, the Irish immigrants, unable to find jobs, joined the US Army. They had no suspicion that this Anglo-Protestant army was poised to invade Mexico, a Catholic country. And when they discovered this, many deserted, including John Riley, an artilleryman who had previously been a sergeant in the British Army in Canada, and about 40 others. Now, why on earth did we invade Mexico in the first place? Well, first of all, Polk decided, once Mexico rejected his very generous offer of $25 million for California and $5 million for New Mexico, that he'd send an army down to the Rio Nueces, which was then the boundary with Mexico, to kind of pressure the Mexicans to reconsider, the offer. And he sent General Zachary Taylor, to command this force. Well, the Mexicans were not intimidated. So he told Zachary Taylor, go ahead and proceed then all the way down to the Rio Grande River. Well, the Rio Grande River at that time was in Mexican territory. And once they had violated what the Mexicans considered their territory, and it was considered that by almost everyone, and that's the way the maps of the day read, the Mexicans retaliated and fired at a scouting party and killed some Americans. Immediately, Polk declared that since American blood was shed on American soil, a state of war existed between the United States and Mexico. Well, John Riley and these other men who had left the US Army joined the Mexicans and formed their own special battalion called the Soldiers of St. Patrick, Los San Patricios. They had their own flag. It was designed by the nuns at St. Louis Potosi. They had their own uniforms. And one of the major battles was in Monterrey. And in Monterrey, the commander in charge of the artillery, to test the effectiveness of the artillery and the range, began shelling the cathedral. Well, the cathedral was where the Mexican general had placed all the civilians in downtown Monterrey for their protection, because it's generally understood in almost any war that the church, the cathedral, is a safe place, and that's where civilians are able to protect themselves. Once the commander of the Mexicans saw that they were shelling the cathedral and mercilessly killing civilians, he agreed to a truce and to withdraw. By that time, the Irishmen who had witnessed the shelling of the cathedral decided they would desert as well, and they joined the San Patricios. So the San Patricios overnight went from a group of 40 men to over 200, which was a battalion. At the Battle of Buena Vista, they served the Mexican cannons very, very well. Mexicans prior to that time were outgunned by the US. They didn't have the same distance to their cannons. Their cannons were older Napoleons. But the San Patricios found ways to place the cannons such that they got a larger reach. They also were able to hook up horses so that they could move and mules so that they could move the cannons a little bit more swifter. And as a result of their actions at Buena Vista, several of them received awards for valor from the Mexican government. So this is where the impasse and the stopping point is for the Mexican War. Zachary Taylor is told to stand down, and the US plans a second pronged attack. And this time by sea. They invaded Veracruz, which was the largest amphibious invasion in the history of the world at that time, second only to what would later become D-Day in 1945. Following the routes to Mexico City, they finally ended up at a place called Churubusco. And at Churubusco, the Irish battalion put up a very stiff fight, but a spark set off their ammunition dump and blew it up. So they were without ammunition, they were fighting with bayonets. And finally, an American captain, tired of the slaughter, himself raised the white flag. When General Twiggs, who was in command, arrived in the convent entrance, he asked the Mexican general, who was General Pedro Anaya, he said, General Anaya, I'll accept your sword and surrender, but first of all, I want to know where is your ammunition supply, your ammunition park. And Anaya's response is a classic one. He said, si tuviera parque, ustedes no estarían aquí. If I had an ammunition park, you wouldn't be here. That was August of 1847. In September, they tried the San Patricios who were captured. Instead of treating them as prisoners of war, which they were in Mexican uniforms, they were whipped at least 50 lashes by a muleteer, and then many of them were hanged. Over 50 of them were hanged. It was the largest hanging affair in North America. I remember at the time when I was researching this, one other historian that I was in correspondence with, who also wrote a book, said to me, well, you know, those were days when punishments were very brutal. As a matter of fact, not only did they whip John Riley more than 50 times until his back looked like carne cruda, according to one witness, but they also brand his cheek with a hot branding iron with a D for deserter. And when they saw that the brand was upside down, they ordered the muleteer to brand his second cheek. You know, and you know, people who witnessed that said, this is barbaric. They call us barbarians. You know, these are the most barbaric people we've ever seen. And, you know, one historian, Robert Rao Miller, said, well, Michael, you have to understand that, you know, this was pretty typical in those times. There were very brutal punishments. Well, I had an opportunity to go to Denver, Colorado right around this time when they were moving the law library. They announced that they were moving the law library, and many books were for sale from the library because they were putting most of the stuff on computers, the Westlaw computer and so on and so forth. So I went up and I asked the librarian, do you have any information, any books on court martials in the 1840s? And she said, I have no idea, but you're welcome to go up to this attic room and search through there. That's where all the 1840s through 1900 stuff is. And she said, anything you find up there, just tell me what you're taking, and it's probably going to be okay. Well, I found a manual called the Hart's Manual on Court Martials, 1846. And in the Hart's Manual on Court Martials, it said the following: if someone is a deserter, the punishment is, if before a war has broken out, the person deserts, it is hard labor or branding with a D in indelible ink, or up to 50 lashes. If a person deserts during war, the punishment is death by firing squad. In no case is hanging to be applied to any individual in uniform. Hanging is only to be administered to a spy who is operating behind enemy lines out of uniform, or to a soldier who has raped a civilian. So not only was the punishments of the Irish excessive, but it was contrary to the laws of court-martial that were in existence at the time. So the largest hanging affair in North America, it's little discussed, little mentioned. As a matter of fact, when we first started researching this at the military archives, they said, no, most of this is Mexican exaggeration. I was fortunate to run into a clerk who gave me access to many of these documents. But anyway, it's the least discussed, the least taught in any schools, whether the United States or Mexico. I think in the United States, we've just kind of passed it over. In Mexico, there's a feeling, well, we were misled by our leaders. But of all the wars that the United States has ever entered into, it was the most successful in terms of access of land. As a result, we captured and took Arizona, Lower Texas, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado, Kansas, and Wyoming. Half of Mexican territory, over 2 million square miles, 2 million square kilometers, or 760,000 square miles. It was the largest territorial war in the United States, and the least known and the least discussed. Incidentally, one of my favorite at the time, President Obama, gave a speech several years ago at West Point, and he said, you know, the great thing about the United States is it's never invaded another country for territory. And I thought, oh my goodness. And you know, and he went to Harvard. But when I was teaching US history, I realized that many of my students had no idea that this war ever took place. And those that did have an inkling were told, oh, it was about a territorial dispute. And besides, the United States paid for it. Anyway, in 1990, when I began my research, and it took me 6 years because I not only researched the US documents, but also the Mexican documents and also Irish documents. So when I began my research, there was one corollary work on the subject by Robert Rao Miller, and he used no Mexican documents at all. He called them deserters and drunks. He didn't examine the religion or race questions, and he called the punishments typical for that era. There was only one memorial. That was the one you saw up, the little plaque with the names in San Angel. So I had many questions. I mean, there were 9,200 desertions in the Mexican War, but only the San Patricios were hanged. Why? All the other deserters were pardoned. You know, so the other thing I found out during my research was that there were 500 books published between 1840 and 1848 on the dangers of Catholicism to the Republic. In 1845 and 46, churches were burnt and convents in Baltimore and Boston. Yeah. Then I came to Mexico and began my research in 1990. I discovered they were heroic in battle, that they had religious motivations. I went to all the battlefield. I discovered that the army had covered up the executions, denied that there was an Irish battalion at all. One of the interesting things that happened when I was in the doing the research in Mexico was to find out that there were people who were uncomfortable with me investigating this, not only in the United States, but also in Mexico. I went to the Museum de Intervenciones, Museo de Intervenciones in Mexico City, which is in the ex-convento where the Battle of Churubusco took place. And I signed up to look at the archives, and the clerk told me, just wait a minute, I'll be right back, I'll get this approved. And when the clerk returns, she said, I'm sorry, but you can't use the archives. And I said, why? And she said, I'm sorry, I don't know, but they just said, no, you can't use them. So I was walking out and I ran into a Catholic priest on the way out. And he said, what's the matter, son? You look very sad. And I said, well, I'm trying to research, the San Patricio Battalion and what happened in the Mexican War, but they won't let me see the archives here. And he said, when you filled out the form, what did you put where it says a país de origen? And I said, I put Estados Unidos, United States. He goes, well, come back at shift change and fill out the form again. And this time when it says país de origen, put down Irlanda, put down Ireland. So I did. I came back after shift change and I filled out another form. And as soon as they got the form, they said, senor, pásale, pásale. and I was allowed in. And while I was there, they even gave me a mozo to go down to the basement to look at boxes. And I got him to open up one of the wooden boxes that was down there. And inside were weapons wrapped in oilcloth. And I unwrapped one of the weapons and it was a rifle. And on the side of the rifle was a plaque that said, Harper's Ferry, 1847, USA. And I thought, wait a minute, they surrendered in 1847. How could they possibly have a cache of US weapons in the basement of this convento? So I asked if I could have permission to photograph them, which I did. And I sent it to Harper's Ferry National Park, the head ranger. And the head ranger wrote me back and he said, oh my goodness, he says, you've solved a great mystery. We knew that there was a burglary of rifles back in 1847, but we didn't know who had done it. And we suspected it was Guatemalan gun runners. And actually you've proved that must be the truth. And I said, how on earth did I prove that? And he said, well, they had blockades, naval blockades at Veracruz. So no ships were able to pass by to Mexico City, with the exception of Guatemalan ships, because Guatemala was putting down a revolution at the time. So they let the Guatemalan ship go by and it had gun runners, bringing weapons to Mexico. The gun runners came up from Guatemala after the ships landed. But by the time they got to Mexico City, of course, the surrender had taken place. So the guns were buried in the basement of the convento. So anyway, that's pretty much the story and what happened. And one of the things I had done, of course, while I was doing all this research was I also enrolled in the doctoral program at the University of Guadalajara in Mexican and Latin American history. And the dissertation for my doctoral thesis was based on the reexamination of the San Patricio Battalion. When I finished this and I got my doctorate degree, I decided to send the manuscript to Oxford University Press. And Oxford University Press accepted it. I signed a contract with them. And they assigned me an editor. And the editor said, well, the one thing we have to do is kind of tone down some of this academic language and kind of, put more narrative stuff in it. So we worked together for a year to polish the book. And when we finally finished, it was submitted to their marketing division. And their marketing division, this is after a whole year now, their marketing division sent out flyers to the major buyers of history books, including California and Texas. And Texas refused to consider it because they said it was anti-American. And as a result, Oxford University Press wrote me and they said, well, we could print it, but probably it would be a niche book and might sell just 4,000 or 5,000 copies. And that's not enough for us to recover costs. So we're going to have to cancel the contract. So I was very depressed. I went to a poetry reading at the University of Guadalajara, and I ran into a young man by the name of Manuel Caballo, and he said, are you writing anything new? You got any poetry out or anything? And I said, well, no poetry, but I have a book on history that was just rejected by Oxford University Press. And he says, well, let me take a look at it. And I gave it to him, and he took it over to the university. And they said, we'd love to do this book, but we don't have any money. If you can get a patrocinador, we'd consider printing it. And I said, how on earth am I going to do that? And they said, well, if you could present it in Spanish to the Heroico Colegio Militar, which is like the West Point of Mexico, and they would co-sponsor it, then the University of Guadalajara would go ahead and publish it. So I did that. It took me probably a month to write the presentation and then another month to memorize it, so my Spanish didn't sound like, like a gringo. It was finally published in Mexico City and in Guadalajara, both in English and in Spanish. It went through 4 editions in English, 2 editions in Spanish. The Spanish translation was done by a Mexican general called Brigadier General Claver Martin. And in 2010, it went out, 2001 rather, it went out of print. And it went out of print because 9/11 happened. And the United States refused to import books from other countries unless they went through a US distributor. And the US distributor wanted 50% discount. And the University of Guadalajara said, well, we don't make any money if we do that. So, we're going to let your book go out of print and we'll give you back your rights. So from 2001 to 2010, it was completely out of print. And then in 2010, we put it up on CreateSpace and Kindle. And that year it went to #1 in Ireland and #1 in Mexico, beyond my wildest dreams. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today too is how can persistence in something you believe that is important can actually change how we see history. Prior to this book, only the plaque in the furniture store existed that you saw earlier. But a year after the publication of Irish Soldiers in Mexico, there was a documentary made by Jason Houle, The Soldiers of St. Patrick. It was nominated for an award at the Cannes Film Festival. The Mexican Postal Department and the Irish Post Office issued a joint commemorative stamp of the San Patricio Battalion. The following year, there was an MGM movie starring Tom Berenger called One Man's Hero. Then, as earlier mentioned by Ron, there was a musical CD with Ry Cooder and the Chieftains. General Claver Chavez had the book translated to Spanish and published. Gold letters were set up in the Jalisco legislature that said Héroes de la República, Battalion de San Patricio in Spanish. And the same was done at the Federal Congress in Mexico City. Molly Malone and the San Patricios, the novel was published. There was a St. Patricios tequila, 1847 tequila. And just recently, another documentary, which is on YouTube, called The Search for John Riley and what might have happened to the leader. And a bust of John Riley was erected in Mexico City as a gift of the Irish government. And a memorial was erected in Clifton, Galway as a gift of the Mexican government to commemorate the battalion. The last known words of Riley in response to a former employer in Canada who wrote and asked why he was living in Mexico, which seemed to his friend to be a dangerous and barbaric place to live, according to US reports. Riley wrote back, "Be not deceived by a country which has been at war with Mexico. These are people among the most hospitable on earth. I know of no other which has been as welcoming." So the solidarity between Mexico and Ireland since the 1990s has resulted in new trade and cultural relationships, massive use of Mexican cement for Dublin construction. Some of you may have noticed that if you've been to downtown Dublin. scholarships for Mexican students to Trinity and NUI Galway, cultural exchanges between the two countries, including Irish dance schools in Guadalajara and Mexico City, an Irish pipe band in Mexico City, and the San Patricios mariachi group in Dublin. Couple of little stories I'd like to end with. When I was doing the research in Washington, D.C., part of the way I was able to do this was we have a program at the American School called Week Without Walls, in which you can take students to a historically significant place. And my choice to take my history kids was Washington, D.C. So we went to the National Archives, of course, and then I went to the military archives. And then, of course, we visited the FBI building and the Iwo Jima Marine Monument, and then the Washington Monument. And when we were at the Washington Monument, the person who was conducting the tour said to us, you'll notice that the Washington Monument, there's two different gradations of marble. One is darker than the other. And the reason for this is that when they began the monument to George Washington, the construction was suspended during the Mexican War. When construction was reestablished, they got marble from a different location, which was a different color. And now the monument also had a different meaning. It symbolized not only George Washington, but the domination of the United States over the entire hemisphere. And I thought to myself, that's a hell of a thing to say to a bunch of Mexican kids. And I thought to myself, I look forward to the day when the Washington Monument is seen as a symbol, a beacon of hope, not as a phallic symbol of domination over other people. And the final story I wanted to tell, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe once wrote that when you do your work quietly and well, unknown friends find you and angels surround you. Well, when I was at the archives, I ran into a clerk by the name of Michael Pilgrim. And I said, sir, do you have any information on the Irish soldiers that fought in Mexico? And he said, yeah, he said, I've got probably 6 or 7 boxes of that stuff back here. And he says, you want to have a look at it? And I said, sure. But I had students with me, so I gave the students a little task to do, and I went back and started looking at it. And I said, is there any way I can copy some of this material? And he says, yeah, but it's a bit pricey. He said, it's $1 a copy. And he said, you're talking about probably 70,000 items. And I said, oh my God. I said, there's no way I can afford that. I'm a teacher in Mexico. And he said, well, leave me your information and I'll see what I can do for you. Well, 3 months later, I got a call from Michael Pilgrim at the National Archives. And he said, how does 39.95 sound? I said, what are you talking about? He said, I put all the documents on microfiche. He said, if you've got a microfiche reader at your library down there, I can let you have it for $39.95. So that's how I wanted to end this story, that, you know, we've entered a new era with Mexico, I think, a new era of possible cooperation, but it begins with individuals talking to individuals. It begins with Michael Pilgrim and people like him going the extra mile to make sure the truth gets out. And you know, we're not responsible for what happened back in 1845, and we're not responsible for slavery, and we're not responsible for any of these things that have happened in our past. But we do need to know the truth about them, and we do need to teach our children the truth about them so that they'll grow up to be more tolerant, more understanding of other cultures, so that they'll realize that, you know, history is not a progression of, you know, bad to better to best. It's a progression, and sometimes it's a reversal. It's a going forward, and sometimes it's a falling back. That history is more nuanced and more complicated and far more interesting than any national planned, plotted, praiseworthy, we are the best type of narrative. We are the best, I think, when we open ourselves up to the truth. We are the best, I think, when we open ourselves up to look at all the evidence and then see where we failed and see where we can do better in the future. Thank you very much.
All right. Dr. Hogan, thank you very much too. It's very, very informative. If anybody, we have time for maybe a couple of questions here. And so if anybody has a question, just put it in the Zoom group chat box and type your question in, and we'll try and get a couple of them answered.
We have a couple for you.
Go ahead.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Martin O'Malley wants to share a point of interest. He mentions that John Riley was from Clifton County, Galway, Ireland, and today a Mexican flag is flown every day in the center of the village.
I got on it.
And also that a sculptor,
So many good-
having some volume problem. Also that a sculpture celebrating the San Patricios is located in the town of Clifton, a gift from the Mexican government. Both Martin O'Malley and William Webb are asking what became of John Riley after the United States closed out the war in Mexico. You told us quite a bit about Sergeant John Riley. Do you have anything else to add, Dr. Hogan?
Yes, well, first of all, I did mention Clifton and the statue there when I was talking about the memorials. As a matter of fact, if you go on my site, there is a site on Facebook called the Irish Soldiers of Mexico. You'll see a photograph of that memorial. I was there when that memorial was dedicated in Clifton, County Galway. After the war, he was promoted to major in the Mexican Army and served in the Mexican Army for 3 years after the war was ended. And then he was discharged. And he was discharged with a very healthy pension, which in those days was, I guess, about $5,000 in US in silver. And that would be something like $60,000 today. So it was a substantial amount. And disappeared into the hinterland. Now, one historian has uncovered a document which appears to be a John Riley who died and was buried in Veracruz. However, my research showed that that was a different John Riley, different age, and and so on and so forth. So if you go to the Ojo de Lago site, which is a magazine in Lake Chapala, you'll see my article on the death of John Riley. It'll give you more details on that. And that's available online, Ojo del Lago.
I think we got time for just one more.
Okay. Alan Ziesman, your question is has a lot of depth to it. I hope we can share it with Dr. Hogan offline and he can communicate with you on it. And Diana Moreires says, thanks so much, Dr. Hogan, wonderful talk. I like the last thought you have shared about finding the truth and teaching history to our kids to learn from it. And I'm wondering what you think about the trend of canceling historical figures like Lincoln in the United States. This is similar to what Alan Ziesman poses. So
yeah, I don't know any responsible historian who really embraces the cancel culture. I think it's a very dangerous place to go. But that does require a much lengthier response.
All right, very good. Dr. Hogan, we thank you for being our speaker today. And we have something for you right here. If you take a good look to commemorate your presentation we have for you. And Ron, if you could put it up there, we have for you from the Midday Rotary Club of San Miguel de Allende. We will make a donation of 10 polio vaccines in your honor to the End Polio Now campaign. And because we're doing all of this via Zoom, we'll be emailing that certificate to you. So we appreciate you being here. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you very much, Skip. And thank you, Ron, as well. And thank you all for attending. Enjoyed it.
All right. Very good. Immediately following our meeting today, folks, we're going to have a club services meeting. So for those of you on, or not, yeah, for not club services, community projects meeting. And for those of you that are on community projects, you're welcome to stay. The rest, have yourself a great day. Have a wonderful St. Patrick's Day tomorrow.
Yep.
Meeting adjourned.